slogan of the Olympics is like stronger, faster, higher, or whatever such nonsense. I think the slogan of the Olympics should be something wicked this way comes. Because wherever the Olympics goes, they absolutely crush the people who happen to live in that city. It does not make good sense. It doesn't make good sense for Chicago. It didn't make good sense for Beijing. It didn't make good sense for Athens. It didn't make good sense for Sydney. You could go down the list, and there's a common thread that runs through every single Olympics that you see. I mean, in some cases it's more extreme than others, but in every single place you have the total wrecking, dilapidation of public housing. I mean, it becomes flattened. You have the flattening of public housing for the creation of Olympic facilities. You have budgets that go completely out of control. You have the crushing of civil liberties, and you have the amping up of police powers. Now, in some places, this becomes monstrous, like in the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City, where hundreds of workers and students were killed to make the city presentable for an international audience. Or in Beijing, where 2 million people were displaced from their homes. But if you look at the United States, it's there too. In Los Angeles in 1984, the completely privatized Olympics where they had the gang sweeps. In 1996 in Atlanta, where they completely trampled the rights of particularly African Americans who lived in that city in an effort to, once again, make the city presentable for an international audience. This is what the Olympics bring, and make no mistake about it, they are budget busters. The original budget for the Athens Games in 2004 was $1.5 billion. It ended up costing, conservatively, $9.5 billion. I mean, if you were running a business this way, it would be, you'd be destroyed. If you had, our budget was 900% higher than we thought. I mean, unless you're part of the corporate elite of a given city that stands to make just insane amounts of money off the real estate development and speculation, or you're with some sort of international conglomerate that wants to use the Olympics to sell its products, the Olympics are a lose, 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 lose situation. There's all this talk that the Olympics are a sporting spectacle that goes back to ancient Greece. But the modern Olympics, the actual modern Olympic Games, start in 1896 in Greece. And it's really with those Olympic Games that you see what we know today as the Olympics, international competition, etc. And it's no coincidence to me that the first Olympics are in 1896, which is also the first great period of empire, of the fight to carve up the world in itty-bitty pieces. Sure enough, those Hitler Olympics in 1936 were actually different from all the other Olympics that had preceded it, in that there was a tremendous emphasis on bombast, on nationalism. I mean, the running of the torch, which is seen as now as something, goes back to ancient Greece. It actually started in 1936 as a way for Nazism to propagandize in different parts of Europe as they made the journey through Europe to get to Germany with the torch. 1948, the Olympics restart again, and you no longer have Nazi Germany on the world map, but you do have the way the Olympics were in 1936. All the traditions of 1936 that were pushed by really fascist regalia have remained part of the Olympic movement since then, and the I.O.C. has reflected that. I mean, there are more fascists and ex-fascists who have been on the International Olympic Committee in the 20th century than in outtakes of the Nuremberg trials. I mean, they're all over the I.O.C. And if you look at Avery Brundage, who really stands astride over the 20th century as the president of the I.O.C. for upwards of 40 years, and then who replaces Avery Brundage was Juan Antonio Samaranch, who was somebody who as a young man was part of Franco's brigade fighting against the Republicans, as they were called, in the battle for Spain in the Spanish Civil War. I mean, you're talking about people whose roots are deep into fascist ideology. And what that means is, I think, it breeds some of the ruthless character of the I.O.C. I mean, this idea that, without question, the end justifies the means, and the ends are a kind of sporting nationalist celebration that, with each successive 4-year period, needs to dwarf the previous one. And I think that's why they loved Beijing, because they knew that China would spend $42 billion to put together the kind of awe-inspiring spectacle that there was, and do it in such a way with a political system that could crush any kind of dissent that dared raise its head. I mean, it's a very ugly process where each country is playing I can top the one that happened 4 years earlier, and with that becomes a pressure to exploit and a pressure to really take a chunk out of the local populace in a way that I think anybody who either believes in human rights or loves sports for the good parts of sports, for the emboldening part of sports, should find what surrounds the Olympic Games repellent. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, I love sports. I love the games. I mean, one of the things about the Olympics that's so great is that it's one of those rare moments where you actually get to see different kinds of sports, where you get to break through the utter humidity of things like football, basketball, baseball, the monotony of the same sports that are shoved down our throats at all times. You get to actually enjoy different kinds of events, swimming, volleyball. I mean, it's interesting to see different kind of athletic endeavors, but we need to actually fight to have those athletic endeavors and that kind of international competition. We need to fight to have that a la carte and not with all the bombast and patriotism and budget busting that comes with the Olympic Games. I'm not from Chicago, but I know a fair amount about the city. And if I lived in Chicago, I would be in the streets protesting to either keep the Olympics out of Chicago or to fight for a series of ironclad assurances about the Olympics coming here. I mean, because what I do know about Chicago is this: Chicago has become famous or infamous over the last 10, 15 years for two processes that certainly exist in other cities, but in Chicago are particularly sharp. One is gentrification, the idea of tearing down public housing for the purpose of creating boutique condo living and forcing poor people to the margins of the cities. That's one process Chicago is known throughout the country for. And the other is police brutality. The idea of a police force that is way too happy with violence, way too happy with coercing confessions, and way too happy with sending people to jail for years at a time for crimes they didn't commit. Think about those two processes for a second: gentrification and police brutality, and think about what the Olympics bring to a given city, which is gentrification on steroids and police brutality like you can't imagine. And considering that Chicago already has these problems and already has these issues, if I lived in Chicago, I would actually be more afraid, more angry, more vigilant about the Olympics than if I lived in any other city in the United States. And that's why I think for people in Chicago, this is about the alarm sounding. I mean, you have to understand that there is a political class committed to get the Olympics here. And it doesn't just involve Mayor Daley, it also involves Barack Obama, the leadership of the Democrat and Republican national parties. Both want the Olympics in Chicago. And if you live in Chicago, that should be reason enough to say, wait a minute, whoa, something stinks here in the Windy City.